I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. I was crying, pressing myself against my husband's chest and hugging him tightly. A bad premonition weighed on my soul like a huge stone, leaving an unpleasant taste somewhere inside. Tears fell on his faded and worn military uniform, but I paid no attention to it. I couldn't take my eyes off him, as if I were seeing him for the last time. Bruce soothingly stroked my hair and kept repeating that he would return for good this time and would no longer go to Afghanistan. Bruce promised that he would stay with me, not realizing that in a few days he would change irreversibly, becoming dangerous not only to our relationship, but to everyone around him. I was sitting in the hospital corridor, hugging my knees and nervously fidgeting with my fingers. I had received a call just an hour ago, informing me that Bruce had returned and was immediately taken to the hospital. The details of his condition or what had happened to him were not disclosed, leaving me in a state of anxiety and uncertainty. Every minute of waiting felt like an eternity, and the uncertainty only deepened my concern. Finally, the doors to the reception area opened, and I stood up, startled by the sudden movement. A nurse came out into the corridor and called for me. I nodded, gathering my strength to cross the threshold and learn the truth about my husband's condition. The nurse gave me a reassuring smile, though there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes as she invited me into the room where Bruce was already waiting impatiently. When the door closed behind me, I saw Bruce, who looked much better than I had expected, considering the mysterious circumstances of his hospitalization. After Bruce's reassuring words to me, our brief moment of calm was interrupted by the arrival of several doctors who entered the room to assess his condition. Discussing his health, the doctors noted that even an old knee injury, which would have previously required long-term treatment, had completely disappeared, and Bruce appeared to be in perfect health. Bruce asked the doctors how the other members of his group were doing. The doctors exchanged glances for a moment, something indeterminate flashing in their eyes that made me wary. After a brief pause, one of the doctors reassured him that all his comrades were also on the road to recovery and that they just needed time to rest. Although the response was reassuring, the way the doctors exchanged glances left me with the feeling that things were not as simple as they seemed. I listened to the doctors, feeling mixed emotions. Inside, I felt that something was wrong, something unclear and potentially troubling. This gave me reason to further ponder the nature of his recovery. After Bruce returned home, I forgot about my worries. The joy of having my husband back overshadowed everything, and we simply enjoyed our moments together. But this moment was short-lived before what happened next. It started with Bruce frequently waking up at night, terrified, sweaty and pale. He would gasp for air frantically, as if he couldn't get enough oxygen. The darkness seemed to thicken around Bruce when he suddenly woke up, covered in cold sweat, his face deathly pale. Bruce's eyes seemed to be veiled, the light from the street lamp through the curtains turning into dancing flames before his eyes, and a dull, all-consuming noise echoed in his head, separating him from reality. What was strange was that Bruce didn't remember waking up. According to him, he just went to bed and slept soundly all night until dawn. I suggested that he visit doctors or a psychologist, but Bruce just brushed off the suggestion, assuring me that he had indeed hit his head hard and perhaps needed a little more time to recover. After Bruce returned home, I forgot about my worries. The joy of having my husband back overshadowed everything, and we simply enjoyed our moments together. But this moment was short-lived before what happened next. It started with Bruce frequently waking up at night, terrified, sweaty and pale. He would gasp for air frantically, as if he couldn't get enough oxygen. The darkness seemed to thicken around Bruce when he suddenly woke up, covered in cold sweat, his face deathly pale. He seemed to go blind, unable to come to his senses, and unresponsive to light, which made him quite nervous. What was strange was that Brucey didn't remember waking up. According to him, he just went to bed and slept soundly all night until dawn. I suggested that he visit doctors or a psychologist, but Bruce just brushed off the suggestion, assuring me that he had indeed hit his head hard and perhaps needed a little more time to recover. But that wasn't the only symptom. The next day, I noticed a new, alarming change in his condition, an insatiable thirst. Suddenly, Bruce's skin seemed incredibly dry, and the water he drank greedily seemed unable to quench it. Bruce didn't seem to feel this new sensation. He tried to convince me that nothing serious was happening, dismissing his ailments as mere adaptation to a change in environment. However, I became increasingly worried about Bruce's symptoms. I watched as, in his unquenchable thirst, he was willing to drink water even from the toilet, and the amount of liquid he consumed exceeded more than 2 gallons. My concern grew with each passing hour, leading me to think that what started as a normal reaction to stress or climate might be something much deeper and potentially dangerous. After Bruce's unquenchable thirst, which didn't seem natural, I decided to investigate his condition myself. In the evening, I delved into research on post-traumatic stress disorder, which often affects veterans, and began looking for contacts of psychologists who specialize in helping military personnel. However, when Bruce stumbled upon my internet searches, it triggered mixed emotions in him, irritation and a sense of offense. After a tense conversation where Bruce insisted he didn't need psychological help, he decided to prove to me that he was fine by demonstrating newly discovered abilities. To convince me, he began recounting details of our neighbors' conversations, who were far enough from our house. The neighbors, preparing a barbecue, were discussing weekend plans, and Bruce, standing next to me in our garden, relayed the content of their conversation almost verbatim, despite the voices barely reaching us. Bruce also demonstrated increased physical strength and agility, performing actions he previously couldn't do on his own. During the demonstration of his new abilities, it seemed that Bruce felt a powerful surge of euphoria. This new sense of strength and control over his body seemed to give him a feeling of invincibility and power. It all intoxicated him, clouding his mind, and so he turned a blind eye to what was really happening to him. Bruce became increasingly detached from the reality of his condition, living in a state where only his newfound physical prowess and freedom from any previous limitations dominated. I was shocked and simultaneously terrified by these powers. Tears filled my eyes every time I tried to convey to Bruce that such changes in his abilities were far from normal and could indicate serious problems that required medical intervention, not silence or denial of reality. But Bruce seemed not to hear me. Instead, he began to get angry, and this anger consumed him entirely. It all spilled over into our communication, and our argument quickly escalated into a quarrel. Therefore, I didn't notice in time the growing aggressiveness in Bruce's behavior, which became another alarming symptom of his condition. Bruce, who had always been a model of restraint, suddenly lost control and hit me. This moment was a shock for both of us. For me, it was like a cold shower that opened my eyes to the seriousness of the situation. I realized how deeply something had changed Bruce, and that these changes had taken him much further than I could have imagined. But this incident affected not only me, it also impacted Bruce. The shock of his own aggression revealed to him the depth of his own change, and it was as if a veil fell from his mind, opening his eyes to what had happened. This caused a deep sense of shame and self-loathing. Bruce froze, then sat down on a chair and lowered his head. I saw how he slumped, as if an invisible burden lay on his shoulders and weighed down his soul. Bruce began to fidget with the edge of his shirt, something he always did when he was nervous. Then he asked me to sit next to him, gently took my hand in his, and looked into my eyes. His gaze literally burned with shame and guilt. Bruce asked me to listen to him until the end, and to keep the story a secret. And then he just started talking. It happened near Kabul, Afghanistan. Bruce went on his last mission, hoping that after this he could stay at the headquarters and spend more time at home with me. This was his dream, As the helicopter landed on the sun-scorched ground, I saw his unspeakable longing and sadness every time he had to go on a mission, and my soul was torn in two, one half of which he took with him. I had often heard that it was because of me that he held on during all the missions, and once, thoughts of me even saved his life. This was in Helmand, when their convoy was destroyed, and he lay among the wreckage of equipment and the bodies of soldiers. Bruce constantly repeated that it was thoughts of me that kept him alive, and he considered it an incredible miracle. At that time, he only sustained a knee injury. Suddenly, their commander called out to them. He reminded everyone of the mission and their plan of action, emphasizing the need to stick to strict order and not ask unnecessary questions. According to him, there were several hermetically sealed containers under an ancient cemetery that had been seized from the Taliban. Their team needed to retrieve these containers, clear the area if necessary, and load them onto the helicopter to deliver them to the scientists. What exactly was in the containers, or what to do in case of a breach, no one explained. To all questions, the commander reminded them that the essence of the mission was paramount, and the rest should not concern them. This should have made Bruce think, but he was so eager to get home as soon as possible that nothing else mattered. The main thing was to complete the mission. So, gathering themselves, the team set off for the destination. The night heat was almost unbearable, but it was only felt when gusts of wind brought waves of scorching air from the desert. As they approached the cemetery, each step echoed in Bruce's chest like distant drums foretelling something bad. The sense of isolation intensified as they stepped onto the cemetery, where under the silvery moonlight, the stone tombstones looked like sleeping sentinels, guarding the peace of past generations. Sneaking between the old graves, Bruce felt goosebumps on his skin. Something in this night silence made him nervous, and the thought that they were delving deeper into a place filled with such antiquity and death only deepened his anxiety. With each step, the atmosphere became more sinister. The wind seemed to carry whispers of the dead, elusive and unexpected. Like the rustling of falling dry leaves on the graves. Bruce stopped, trying to listen to the night sounds, but apart from the distant howling of the wind playing around the old cypresses, nothing was heard. This empty cemetery seemed alive, filled with spirits of the past that did not wish for peace. Bruce felt his chest tighten at the thought that they had become part of something ancient and invisible, inseparable from this forgotten piece of land. In the depths of the cemetery, among the mighty shadows of old trees, lay a building, half destroyed by an explosion. It was likely intended for rituals, which in itself was frightening. Its walls, built of gray stone, had acquired shades of moss and dust over the years, and the carved arches covered with cracks testified to a centuries-old history. Once a gathering place, now it was abandoned and forgotten, silently losing its original purpose. When Bruce and his team approached the building, the heavy wooden doors creaked under their hands. The air inside was cool and damp, noticeably different from the scorching hot wind outside. The interior was minimal, with a worn-out altar that had long been unused, and half-destroyed rags hanging from all sides. It was under a pile of such rags that a mysterious narrow passage was hidden. This passage, almost imperceptible at first glance, was the key to their mission, as it led to the underground, with only their flashlights for illumination. The team took cautious steps down, each of which echoed dully in the dark corridors stretching underground. Descending into the underground, the first thing Bruce noticed was the smell. In ancient places, especially those underground, the smell can hardly be called pleasant, but here it was something else. A sharp, unpleasant odor seemed to envelop them, and the whole team initially couldn't breathe. The unknown smell seemed to burn their lungs, but after a few seconds, they felt a sweet and intoxicating stream of air that brought incredible relief. Being in full combat readiness, they began to slowly move through the dark corridor in search of the containers, or those who might be guarding them. Wandering through the corridors, they finally reached the place safe and sound. It was a small room, illuminated only by moonlight, coming through small grates installed in the ceiling. In the middle of the room was an ancient stone altar, carved with various incomprehensible symbols. On it stood their target, the containers they needed to retrieve. But as soon as Bruce took a step, a tall figure suddenly appeared in the passage opposite him. At that moment, all the team members raised their weapons and carefully watched the stranger. He slowly entered the room and walked to the altar. Under the sinister moonlight, which pitifully seeped through the thick grate of the high underground window, the atmosphere in the room became even more eerie. Bruce watched in horror as the stranger's figure flickered in the dim light. Perhaps this figure had once been human, but now it was just a terrifying presence. The expression on its face twisted Bruce's insides with fear. It was contorted into a painful mask that would frighten death itself. Black veins bulged under the skin, intertwining into a dreadful network across the entire face. They especially thickly framed his eyes, where burst capillaries filled the whites with blood, turning the gaze into bloody whirlpools of pain and madness. This gaze was so deep and disturbing that it seemed as if it could devour the soul itself. The skin in some places was so dry and tense that it seemed almost stone-like and cracked under the pressure of the desiccating forces that bound it. The entire scene exuded an aura of deep suffering and dark mystery, further heightening the sense of danger that filled the space. Such a picture only deepened the horror that enveloped Bruce, making his heart beat in the rhythm of a distant and relentless drumbeat that foretold only evil. Bruce, not taking his eyes off the mutilated face, instinctively touched the safety catch, checking his readiness to shoot at the right moment. The creature made no sound, just stood and looked at each team member with blood-red eyes. No one seemed able to move, frozen by the appearance of the unexpected guest. Suddenly, in the midst of the night silence, Bruce felt a slight dizziness, a harbinger of something inevitable and eerie. His eyes caught the gaze of the figure, whose eyes blazed with red fire. This creature, with superhuman speed and a barely noticeable smirk on its lips, chose him. "You are the one. Yes, you." These words echoed in Bruce's head like the reverberation of an ancient curse. The stranger lunged, literally knocking Bruce off his feet with an almost imperceptible movement. The blow sent a searing pain through Bruce's knee, spreading throughout his body, tearing a scream of agony from him. He found himself on the ground, powerless to find his gun in the engulfing darkness, while watching this shadowy figure with unheard-of strength scatter his team one by one. The soldiers seemed to have no chance against this creature, which easily dodged bullets and tightly gripped its victims, breaking them with cold satisfaction. When everyone was down, the stranger's twisted face of satisfaction reappeared before Bruce. Its dark eyes radiated a sense of hunger and eternal thirst that knew no satisfaction. The creature slowly leaned over the lying Bruce, opening its mouth wide like an abyss from which there was no retreat. What was happening was too fast and horrifying for Bruce to fully comprehend. He only felt hope and reality slipping away, leaving him at the mercy of that dreadful entity that had come not only for him, but for his entire team. Time seemed stretched, and the last rays of sunlight faded as darkness engulfed everything around. I froze, listening to Bruce's story. At first, I didn't realize how deeply the shivers had taken hold of my body. My mind refused to believe what I was hearing. Bruce was recounting the horrors that had happened to him in Afghanistan, events that sounded so incredible that it seemed like a nightmare. I didn't want to believe any of it. It seemed like my husband had gone mad, but deep down, I knew Bruce wouldn't lie about such things. I trembled with shock and worry, pondering what he had told me. How should I proceed? How could I help the person I love if I didn't even understand what was happening to him? Bruce refused to visit the military hospital. He feared being placed in a psychiatric ward or used as a test subject, but he agreed to see a psychologist. Perhaps deep down he was also seeking salvation, though he didn't admit it out loud. In my heart, I hoped that all this could be a fabrication, a result of stress or trauma. Maybe a psychologist could help him cope with these hallucinations, but I also knew I had to be prepared for any outcome. Regardless of what lay ahead, I wouldn't leave Bruce alone in this fight. However, At the appointed time, Bruce didn't show up for the appointment. When I entered the living room, my gaze immediately fell on my husband, curled up in the corner of the room. Bruce was in an extremely terrible state, with cracked and extremely pale skin that resembled the surface of old, dried earth. His eyes had an unnatural reddish hue, glowing with inner irritation, and his lips were chapped and cracked, as if they hadn't met moisture in a long time. His hands clearly bore traces of blood, which seemed still wet and fresh. My heart pounded with fear when I saw that he was holding the body of the neighbor's dog. His hands tightly gripped the lifeless body of the animal, and thick crimson liquid dripped from his fingers, painting dark patterns on the floor. Everything indicated that Bruce had killed the dog with his own hands. I stood stunned, afraid to approach the man who had once been the embodiment of kindness and protection for me. Now he seemed like something else, almost a monster from my worst nightmares. This was a completely different person, someone I couldn't recognize. My thoughts were filled with fear and despair, and my soul was torn between the desire to help Bruce and the fear for my own life. Watching his condition in horror, I realized that the situation was much more serious than I could have imagined. Now I faced a dilemma: how to help a man who literally burns from ordinary sunlight, and that our shared life might never return to normal. So, after I drew all the curtains and closed the windows, I called the psychologist, begging them to come to us. I didn't take my eyes off the terrified and pale Bruce, who continued to sit in the corner of the living room. While waiting for the specialist, I began to nervously pace back and forth near my husband until I heard his muttering. My heart seemed to stop, and I was afraid to turn to Bruce, but I looked anyway. My husband began to rock with the dog in his hands, muttering something under his breath. He spoke so quietly that I couldn't make out what he was saying. I only heard fragments, something like, "No, don't touch her. I understand. I'll find it." When I asked who Bruce was talking to, I received only a groan in response. At this, I couldn't hold back and collapsed into a chair, feeling powerless. I couldn't stop the tears. These events scared me more and more, but I was also overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness, as I didn't know what to do or how to help my husband. Suddenly, the door opened, revealing a tall man in a professional suit, and my face lit up with relief. I recognized Dr. Silver, the psychologist I had been waiting for. I led him through the dark corridor to the living room, where Bruce was still curled up in the corner, lost in his own thoughts. Dr. Silver, calm and focused, frowned and stopped when he saw Bruce. The psychologist tried to start a conversation, but Bruce avoided contact, his gaze empty and absent. When Bruce asked for water, I got up, hoping it might help calm him down. I quickly returned from the kitchen with a glass of water, which I handed to him cautiously. However, instead of drinking the water, Bruce suddenly displayed unexpected strength and aggression. He lunged at me, knocked me to the floor, and began to strangle me. His eyes radiated superhuman rage, and his breathing was heavy and erratic. I screamed, trying to break free, but fear and Bruce's physical advantage quickly drained my strength. At this critical moment, Dr. Silver intervened, grabbing Bruce by the shoulders and pulling him away from me with all his might. Bruce, filled with sudden fury, turned on the psychologist. Dr. Silver tried to fend him off, but Bruce was too strong. Suddenly, Bruce opened his mouth, and from his lips, pressed against Silver's face, emerged a parasite, resembling a huge worm. The parasite was black, with barely noticeable shades of green, its body writhing as it sought a way inside. At its front end were tiny suckers that helped it hold on and penetrate the host. Its movements were cold and calculated, quickly disappearing into the psychologist's mouth, leaving him in despair and powerless to resist. This moment revealed the terrifying truth about the changes happening to Bruce, and the threat the parasite posed not only to him, but to others around him. After the attack, Bruce and Dr. Silver suddenly calmed down, as if they had exhausted all their aggression. They silently sat next to each other on the couch, immersed in their own thoughts or feelings, inaccessible from the outside. Any attempts I made to get their attention were met with silence and immobility, ignoring my calls and questions. Overwhelmed by shock and despair, I felt my world completely falling apart. I sat on the floor, losing any hope of rescue or understanding of what had happened. This eerie silence that filled the room reflected my own helplessness in a world that had suddenly ceased to be understandable or safe. When the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, Bruce and Dr. Silver suddenly flinched, as if those sounds evoked an indescribable sense of foreboding in them. Their movements became more coordinated, and they involuntarily glanced towards the windows, trying to determine the source of the sound. Feeling anxious, I approached the window to see what was happening outside. I stared through the glass, watching the flashing lights that passed by on the street. At that moment, when my attention was fixed on the window, Bruce and Dr. Silver seized the moment and almost silently slipped past me towards the exit. Only when the sound of an engine starting reached my ears did I turn around and see that the living room was empty. I rushed to the door, but it was too late. Through the open door, I heard the sound of a departing car. I stood there, stunned and powerless, watching as the vehicle turned onto the street and disappeared from my sight, leaving me completely alone with the noise of the sirens in the background. A tense atmosphere immediately enveloped my house as a series of military and black vehicles quickly pulled up to the gate. Armed soldiers and strangers in black suits emerged from the heavy vehicles, swiftly taking control of the area. Following them were scientists in protective suits, anxiously checking their equipment and scrutinizing the building. Among them was Bruce's commander, a middle-aged man with a determined look, who unhesitatingly led the operation. The commander addressed me in an authoritative tone, inquiring about Bruce's whereabouts and whether I had managed to contact him. His questions were relentless, demanding answers. When I tried to find out what was happening, the responses were vague, but they did reveal part of the truth. The commander explained that during the mission in Afghanistan, Bruce had become a host to a parasite that the government had ordered to be brought to the base. He mentioned something about an ancient race and how they were used by ancient cultures during sacrifices. This revelation stirred a whirlwind of emotions in me. It was true. All of Bruce's words. It was a horrifying truth. And now the military was hunting my husband. According to them, Bruce was tormented by a growing power that could become uncontrollable, and before it reached its peak, it was crucial to find him and retrieve what was taken. The military noted that much depended on me, as I could persuade Bruce to return what he had taken, convincing him of the necessity for his own good and the safety of everyone else. Feeling the weight of the situation, I stood among the armed soldiers and scientists, burdened not only by fear for Bruce, but also by the understanding that my actions would determine my husband's safety. I sat in the quiet living room as scientists with measuring equipment carefully inspected every corner of the house. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety and tension. The devices emitted low beeps and hisses, adding a laboratory-like quality to the space. The sounds of their work resembled the whispers of spirits wandering through the rooms, leaving traces of an invisible presence. Despite all efforts, none of those present could find Bruce or establish contact with him. Burdened by fear and anxiety for my husband's fate, I gathered all my courage to explain the situation to the commander. My voice trembled with emotion as I explained that Bruce was not to blame. I assured them that he hadn't stolen anything intentionally, and if he had something that didn't belong to him, he would gladly return it. I spoke about his condition with a voice full of concern, emphasizing that he felt very unwell, and I feared for his life. My words echoed through the half-empty house, as if reverberating through the shadowed corridors. Each word was heavy and laden with pain. The commander listened, his face frozen in a mask of professional restraint, but his eyes showed that he understood the seriousness of the situation. The commander, listening to me, carefully weighed my words. Although he expressed understanding of my fears and wishes, he replied that the situation was much more complicated than it might seem at first glance. He noted that it would be better for Bruce to return voluntarily, as their goal was to retrieve what belonged to them. The commander hinted that if Bruce didn't appear and cooperate, the military would have few options left and might take more radical measures. He said that if they couldn't establish contact with Bruce, they might take me to the military base for detailed questioning, hoping that this might prompt Bruce to make contact or help them obtain the necessary information. This prospect only deepened my sense of horror and helplessness. I felt the walls of our home, which had once been my refuge and comfort, now turning into a prison with no way out. Dark thoughts about the upcoming interrogation and possible separation from my home and the life I knew made my heart clench with fear. Suddenly, the communication devices of everyone present came to life simultaneously, and Bruce's voice echoed through the radios of each soldier. He sharply and sternly ordered them not to touch me, warning that otherwise, everyone present would suffer serious consequences. His words were marked by authority and threat, causing everyone to freeze in tension. Almost immediately after, one of the scientists reported that they had managed to pinpoint Bruce's approximate location. The military immediately began to act, mobilizing their forces and gathering equipment, preparing to leave the house to intercept Bruce. However, at the last moment, when the team was almost out the door, the commander unexpectedly stopped and looked at me. He ordered the soldiers to seize me and take me with them, believing that I could be useful in resolving the situation. Panic gripped my heart. Understanding what was happening, I began to struggle and resist. The soldiers quickly and decisively took control of me, leading me out of the house. My screams and efforts to break free were futile against the cold determination of the military. Thus, I found myself in a truck driving away from our home, leaving behind only darkness and uncertainty about what awaited me next. Meanwhile, the scientists who were meticulously analyzing data from the area where Bruce was last seen suddenly stumbled upon a significant clue. It turned out that a strange radio signal, which did not match usual communication frequencies, had been detected in the vicinity of a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This signal, full of disturbances and anomalies, was a clear indication of the presence of something unusual, possibly related to Bruce or the parasite controlling him. Armed with this information, the commander immediately organized a military unit for immediate deployment to the specified warehouse. Meanwhile, I, exhausted by anxiety and despair, was forced to accompany them. My heart was racing with a speed bordering on panic. I felt the cold hands of fear enveloping me with every mile that brought us closer to the warehouse. The entrance to the warehouse was grim. The abandoned area, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dilapidated buildings, created a sense of unease and threat. Dark clouds gathered overhead, as if nature itself was trying to warn of the danger lurking inside. Upon arrival, the military quickly deployed, securing the perimeter, while I watched from the side, holding my breath. The sounds of our footsteps echoed through the metallic emptiness of the warehouse, where every whisper or creak seemed like the voice of ghosts from the past. The soldiers, with flashlights in hand, illuminated dark corners where every shadow could hide a threat. I stood in the midst of this tense atmosphere, feeling my fear turn into terror, mixed with helplessness. The darkness inside the warehouse seemed almost tangible as the military units began their search deep within the labyrinth of corridors. The quiet rustle of the wind outside the windows was suddenly interrupted by a scream. It was not a human sound. It echoed supernaturally and piercingly, sending chills down my spine. The soldiers hesitantly looked around, their weapons ready to fire. Suddenly, without any warning, one of the soldiers started shooting at his comrades. His eyes blazed with a wild light, as if he was possessed by something other than human. Bullets whizzed through the air, whistling past the ears of other soldiers, who responded with panicked gunfire. The unit instantly descended into chaos, where everyone quickly lost understanding of who was friend and who was foe. I stood at a distance, paralyzed with horror. I watched as the nightmarish scene unfolded before me. Hearing my heart beat in despair and helplessness, I realized that it was Bruce, whose consciousness was controlled by something, and he could now control other people. This thought filled me with even greater fear of the power that resided in my husband. In the dark corners of the warehouse, among old metal cabinets and scattered containers, a firefight ensued. Black smoke, blood on the floor, and the screams of the wounded filled the space with a dreadful symphony of destruction. In desperation and confusion, I ran through the corridors of the warehouse, searching for an escape from this nightmare. I heard the chaos continuing behind me, the sounds of gunfire growing fainter and more distant, overshadowed by cries of pain and fear. My breathing became heavier. My heart pounded in my chest when suddenly 2 strong hands grabbed me and quickly pulled me into a small room, slamming the door shut behind me. The darkness of the room was thick and impenetrable, with only a faint groan echoing off the walls. I cried, trying to break free, but stopped when I felt a familiar presence. The moment I sensed Bruce's presence, my heart filled with relief for a moment. I longed to embrace him, to feel the warmth of his body and the sense of safety he once gave me. However, when I tried to touch him, Bruce recoiled. He avoided any contact, as if afraid to pass his pain on to me. I was stunned when my gaze fell on Bruce's face. He was barely recognizable. The skin on his face was dry, cracked, and in some places seemed burnt, like autumn leaves. His eyes, once bright and lively, were now covered with a cloudy film that dimmed any spark of life that once existed in them. He looked exhausted and sickly, his figure trembling from weakness and inner struggle. It pained me to look at the man I loved. He had become the embodiment of horror and despair. I felt every corner of my heart fill with pain and sorrow for how our lives had irreversibly changed. Bruce's body, once strong and energetic, was now just a shadow, a fragile shell for something sinister and elusive that had taken control of him. I cautiously stepped back, gathering my will to cope with my own fear and grief. I knew I had to find the strength to help Bruce, or at least stop what could get out of control and pose a threat to the entire world. A gloomy silence prevailed around, broken only by the whisper of our heavy breaths and the distant sound of chaos beyond the walls of this room. Bruce began to explain that a parasite lived inside him, draining all his life force, turning him into a tool for its reproduction. These creatures were preparing to use his body to create new hosts, turning him into a breeding ground for their sinister spread. If the process was not stopped, the parasites would consume all the life left in him. Suddenly, we felt a chill from the approach of footsteps. The sounds approaching from the corridor suddenly activated the parasite in Bruce. His face instantly changed, muscles tensed, his gaze narrowed and sharpened, like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. His figure seemed even more terrifying in the dim light seeping through the window cracks. When the door suddenly opened, a few surviving soldiers burst into the room. Led by the commander, they aimed their weapons at Bruce, but he, endowed with the parasite's supernatural speed, managed to dodge the bullets. His movements were swift and sharp, like shadows gliding under the moonlight. Bruce tore through the soldiers, his attacks targeted and deadly, each move aimed for maximum damage. He grabbed one soldier, tightly squeezing his throat until he drew the last breath from his body. He shoved others with such force that their bodies hit the walls with a dull thud that echoed down the corridor. The commander, trying to stop Bruce, approached from behind and opened fire on him, but the bullets seemed to just glide over his skin, leaving no marks. Bruce turned, his eyes reflecting a soulless gleam, and in one swift motion, he snatched the weapon from the commander's hands and easily broke his arm. Fear and horror filled the room, the screams of pain and despair echoing off the walls. The moment of Bruce's assault on the commander became the culmination of the horror unfolding in this place. Everything happened quickly, ominously, and brutally. I stood too close, stunned and paralyzed by fear. I watched as life left the commander's body. His eyes lost any spark, and his body slowly slumped in Bruce's hands. This scene etched itself into my memory as a dreadful symbol of loss and despair. Once a loving husband, Bruce had turned into an incomprehensible monster, controlled by a parasite that transformed him not only physically, but also morally. Despite the horrific events unfolding before my eyes, I tried to hold on to the slightest spark of love for Bruce, who stood before me as a shadow of his former self. He tried several times to come closer, suppressing his pain and trying to calm me, but each of his movements only deepened the fear in my eyes, reflecting both love and horror for the man who had once been my comfort and protection. My heart was torn between the desire to flee and the need to help Bruce, but my turmoil was suddenly interrupted when Dr. Silver entered the room. He looked exhausted, but determination burned in his eyes. Seeing the bodies of the soldiers scattered on the floor, he immediately grasped the scale of the tragedy. He raised his hands in a gesture of reconciliation, trying to calm Bruce, whose gaze was filled with torment and suspicion. In the tense atmosphere of the room, where every breath seemed loud, Dr. Silver slowly approached Bruce, moving cautiously, as if on thin ice. His face expressed compassion and understanding, yet he was ready to act. He knew that the discovery made during his torturous merging with the parasite might hold the key to freeing Bruce from this dreadful fate. Silver calmly, almost soothingly, began to tell Bruce that he knew how to get rid of the parasite and survive. After the military vehicles disappeared from sight, Dr. Silver unexpectedly returned to our house. He approached the safe located in the corner of the study, entered the combination, and opened it. From inside, he carefully took out a gun, checked it for bullets, and placed it in a holster. Silver left the house, approached his car, and started the engine. As he drove, his hands trembled with uncertainty. The parasite, implanted by Bruce, gave him new instructions and directions. He felt Bruce's consciousness invading his own thoughts, imposing a foreign will on him. Bruce, now able to control Dr. Silver from a distance, directed him to the next step in their sinister plan. Dr. Silver drove to a small, remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where he knew materials and equipment were stored that could help in treating or further researching the condition caused by the parasite. This place was used to store samples and substances that could be the key to unraveling the mystery of the parasite and its impact on humans. On the tense road to the warehouse, lined with the thick shadows of evening trees, Dr. Silver suddenly lost control of his body. His car abruptly braked on the roadside, the wheels screeching loudly, slicing through the silence of the night road. He stumbled out of the car, clutching his heart as if it were caught in the grip of an invisible hand. A cry of pain escaped his throat, muffled and twisted. The psychologist fell to his knees among broken branches and dry leaves, his body writhing in agony. Unbearable pain pierced every cell. It seemed as if his own blood had turned into molten lead, relentlessly coursing through his veins. Silver felt his mind stretching between worlds, between human consciousness and the dark depths inhabited by the parasite. It was then that he began to see, not with sight, but with something deeper, ancient, and powerful. The parasite's memories, its primal instincts, and its drive for survival unfolded before Silver. Like an open book, he saw worlds the parasite had devoured, creatures it had controlled, and realized that these beings were not just parasites, but part of an ancient ecosystem that existed long before humanity. Dr. Silver, filled with newfound horrific knowledge, couldn't understand why he had become the bearer of the mysterious memories of this ancient entity. Was it a random coincidence or part of a larger, unseen plan? He didn't know the answers, but he felt that now he held crucial information that could save not only himself, but also Bruce. With a new sense of mission, Silver sped back to the warehouse where Bruce remained. The night enveloped everything in a thick fog, creating a mystical atmosphere. The trees along the road flickered with shimmering silhouettes, like ghosts of the past, witnesses to the horrors that unfolded in the darkness. Hope, which had almost faded from our hearts, suddenly flared up with new strength. We could almost feel the dark chains that bound us beginning to crumble. With a growing understanding of the way forward, we headed towards the exit of the warehouse, enveloped in the soft light of flashlights, which seemed too bright after a long time in the darkness. But as soon as we stepped onto the threshold of freedom, a new threat suddenly appeared before us. A new squad of soldiers, equipped with gas masks and heavy weapons, emerged from nowhere. Their faces were hidden behind masks, with only impersonal eyes peering out from behind protective glass. These soldiers wasted no time on questions or warnings. They began spraying an unknown gas into the air, which instantly filled the space with the stench of chemical poison. Bruce and Dr. Silver, already vulnerable due to the parasite's influence, felt unbearable pain and suffocation as the toxic fumes entered their lungs. Both fell to the cold concrete, screaming in agony, struggling for every breath. Their screams echoed through the empty warehouse, creating a dreadful chorus of sorrow and pain. Overwhelmed with despair and helplessness, I rushed to Bruce. I fell to my knees beside him, cradling his head, trying to provide some comfort in his final moments. My hands held his face as I sobbed, begging the soldiers for mercy or help. But there was no response from them, only impersonal gazes, and another release of gas that seemed to fill every crevice in the room. In that eerie atmosphere, where every breath brought pain, every scream echoed with agony, it became clear there was no way back. The dark forces that had unleashed the parasite had taken everything, hope and the future. Confronted with the edge of human horror, I realized that I had lost everything I once loved, and now I could only sit beside the broken shells of those I had tried to save. Bruce, using the last remnants of his strength, painfully raised his hand and grasped my delicate fingers. His eyes, once so bright and full of life, were now clouded with the murkiness of pain and despair. The look, filled with boundless love and unspeakable guilt, was the last thing I saw in his eyes before they lost their sparkle forever. His hand weakened in my grip, and Bruce's body silently slumped, becoming just a shadow of who he once was. Immediately after, one of the soldiers roughly grabbed me, lifted me from my knees, and carried me to the exit. I resisted, screamed, flailed my arms, trying to break free from his iron grip. My eyes filled with tears. My heart pounded in despair when I suddenly saw parasites beginning to slither out of Bruce's and Dr. Silver's mouths. Black, writhing creatures with unpleasant slime slowly crawled towards the soldiers and me, heightening the atmosphere of horror. The soldiers, in a panic, began shouting commands, pointing out the threat. "Destroy them! Keep your distance!" they shouted, immediately starting to spray gas intended to kill the escaping parasites. Clouds of toxic gas filled the space, muffling the screams and filling the air with a heavy, suffocating smoke. The gas quickly spread, and the parasites, which had just escaped to freedom, began to curl up and wither from the poison, reflecting a dreadful scene of death. Despite my resistance, I was led out of the building, my cries and pleas mixing with the sounds of chaos raging around. I continued to struggle, breaking free from the soldier's grip, who carried me away from Bruce's body. My heart pounded in my chest with such force that each beat felt painful. My eyes, full of tears and despair, watched as the warehouse where everything had just happened grew smaller. Then I saw the soldiers begin to pour fuel around the building, and a deep anxiety stirred in my chest. The blaze lit up the night sky, casting an eerie red glow on the faces of the soldiers, who soon set the warehouse on fire. Tongues of flame quickly engulfed the structure, merging into a hellish blaze that greedily consumed wood, metal, and everything inside. The immense waves of heat were felt even from a distance, and I felt the heat scorching my face. The tears on my cheeks evaporated from the heat as I watched the last evidence of the horror we had experienced disappear in the consuming fire. The sounds of the fire's crackling mixed with my sobs and the screams of the parasites dying in the flames. All of this created a chorus of horror that resonated in my soul with a shock of pain and despair. The pain of loss, the pain of being unable to change the past, the helplessness in the face of such a dreadful reality. All of this weighed on me as I walked away from the burning warehouse under the control of soldiers who neither knew nor understood the depth of my suffering. My soul felt exhausted and empty as around me, enveloped in despair and sorrow, the ruins of my past life burned to ashes. The vehicle that carried me sped through indistinct streets with a muted hum. Inside the vehicle, where tense silence reigned, I watched the flickering lights pass by. After the interrogation, where I thoroughly recounted everything that had happened. The hope for a quick release quickly faded. The military seemed to have no intention of letting me go. The sense of safety and escape was an illusion. Inside me, panic and oppressive anxiety grew. I snapped, began shouting at the soldiers, demanding answers, but my voice was immediately drowned out. Suddenly, foreign thoughts flashed through my mind, not my own. Thoughts emerging from the depths of the consciousness of the people around me. With horror, I realized that I had been infected by the parasite from Bruce, which now forced me to hear what should not have been heard. I froze, stopping my screams. I quietly but confidently spoke, knowing the answer even before I uttered the words. I realized that I would never leave this place. It was more than imprisonment. It was the end of my freedom, the end of everything I held dear. The soldiers, noticing my change in behavior, quickly reacted. With cold calculation, one of them pulled out a syringe with a paralytic and injected it into my body. I felt my muscles lose strength, my movements becoming impossible. My body refused to obey, and my mind slowly sank into the darkness of despair. Unable to resist, I felt myself being lifted and carried through the dimly lit area of the military base. I was like detached from reality, almost as if in a dream, where the mind was paralyzed by fear and helplessness. They carried me to a plane standing on the runway, where workers were already loading hundreds of empty containers. I was placed on a stretcher that coldly and mercilessly strapped my body, forcing me to stop any resistance. My eyes involuntarily slid to the horizon, where dawn was beginning. The first rays of the sun touched my face, bringing a tiny hint of warmth to my cold existence. I looked at the sunrise, realizing that perhaps this was the last time I could see this wonder of nature. As I was loaded onto the plane, amidst the dull roar of engines and the sounds of loading, I saw a container secured next to me with dozens of parasites like the ones I had seen in Bruce. I felt an unpleasant writhing inside, and suddenly heard a phrase that shattered the last remnants of my strength. These were words I didn't hear aloud, but which echoed in my mind with the clarity of a dreadful truth. The experiment was successful, transferring the infected subject to the laboratory and beginning phase 2. These words marked the end of my freedom and the beginning of a new, terrifying chapter in life that was no longer in my hands. Bound by the chains of my fate, I lay on the stretcher, looking at the distant sun, which gradually disappeared beyond the horizon of consciousness. My thoughts fled to a place where there was no pain or fear, while the real world continued its passage of time, separated from my inner world, filled only with echoes of irreparable losses and hopelessness. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.